Back in 2022, I made my first marathon of reviews focused on every mainline console Zelda game from A Link to the Past to Tears of the Kingdom, but I had intentionally left two titles out, that being the original Legend of Zelda and Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. I stated at the time,
I go back to these games and they're just way too archaic and just not what I really consider Zelda.
what a stupid asshole. Looking back, I realized that I was just using it as an excuse to get to the better games in the series, and I wanted to have my first review be a game that I knew decently well, that of course being Link to the Past. Today I right the wrong I made all those years ago. For this video, I'm finally tackling the very first entry in one of my favorite franchises of all time, The Legend of Zelda. We'll save Zelda 2 for the next video since that's going to be its own beast. This is a video 3 years in the making, so let's finally dive into The Legend of Zelda for the NES.
I won't go in depth with my personal history with the Zelda series since I covered it pretty thoroughly in the Link to the Past video. The only major history I have with this title is the playthrough I did for this review, so I feel there's no need to go into my whole life story. During the development of Super Mario Bros., Shigeru Miyamoto had begun conceptualizing a second game in parallel to be the flagship title for the Famicom Disk System, an add-on for the original Famicom that allowed games to be played on floppy disks. This game was conceptualized at first to be a game that allowed two players to create labyrinths and explore each other's creations. The team found that exploring the labyrinths was more fun than creating them, so they began to rework their approach with this in mind. Miyamoto mentioned in an interview that one of the major inspirations for this title, codenamed Adventure Title, was from his time playing outside in caves and mountains near his childhood home. He also stated that while developing the game, he knew it needed to be different from Mario, as while Mario was a linear platformer, this title was to be a real-time adventure game. After some time, they eventually came up with the story, thanks to Takashi Tezuka, and the setting for the game, and the original Legend of Zelda was released in 1986. This was a big year for Nintendo, as two of their other franchises debuted the same year, being Metroid and Kid Icarus.
But what about the story of the game? You know, what was The Legend of Zelda? Well, sit back, kids, as I tell you a story.
Long ago, Ganon, Prince of Darkness, stole the Triforce of Power... Wait, what? Aw, no! They replaced the story crawl from the original game in the NSO release. Hold on a second. There we go. I'm sorry, I gotta read through this because it's so funny to me. Many years ago, Prince Darkness Ganon stole one of the Triforce with power. Princess Zelda had one of the Triforce with wisdom. She divided it into 8 units to hide it from Ganon before she was captured. Go find the 8 units, Link, to save her. Man, it is so unbelievably cheesy and poorly translated that I can't help but smile. But let's actually talk about the story, which I can actually use some added context from future games that would come out later. Thank you, Zelda Encyclopedia. After the many adventures of the hero of legend, the kingdom of Hyrule would enter a state of decline. The borders of the kingdom shrunk, and the once massive kingdom was now small and overrun with evil. One day, the Prince of Darkness, Ganon, invaded the kingdom with his forces and stole the Triforce of Power from the royal family. But before he could take the Triforce of Wisdom, Princess Zelda shattered the relic into 8 different pieces and hid them throughout the land. The Triforce has 3 major pieces in total, each representing a different attribute, being power, wisdom, and courage. If you're wondering where the Triforce of Courage is, technically it doesn't exist yet, but I'm going to assume as of this game it's negotiating with its union for a better contract. Princess Zelda sends her nursemaid Impa to find a man with enough courage to defeat Ganon before she was imprisoned by the King of Evil. Impa is saved from a fate worse than death by a young man named Link, who after hearing of Zelda's story is filled with a burning sense of justice and resolves to collect the pieces of the Triforce of Wisdom, rescue the princess, and defeat Ganon to reclaim the Triforce of Power. This is a much more simplistic story compared to later entries, which, I mean, it makes sense, this is an NES game after all. But it's still kind of cool to see the first iteration of Hyrule, the Triforce Trio, and all of the enemies that roam the land. So as Link, you need to traverse this world of Hyrule to collect items and tools to prepare for the duel with Ganon. When you boot the game up, the only thing Link can do is walk. He has no way of defending himself other than blocking projectiles with his shield. But right when you start the game, you can head inside this cave to meet with this old man, who will give you the wooden sword. You use that sword with the A button, and whatever item you have equipped in this other slot can be used with the B button. When you find them, anyway. Upon defeating enemies, you'll sometimes get rupees, this game's currency. There are a few different shops you can find out in the open caves that sell you different items, like the blue candle, that'll let you burn some bushes to find secret areas and light up dark rooms and dungeons, bombs to use offensively against enemies or to blow up holes in the wall, and even some other upgrades or items, like the blue ring, which increases your defense, or the magic shield, which lets you block more projectiles. Just keep in mind that these items can be pretty expensive, but specific shops will have certain items at a lower price, so just keep that in mind. How do you find these shops and items? Explore. Like I mentioned earlier, there are bushes you can burn and walls you can blow up to find shops and the like. The only problem is that you won't know which bush to burn or which wall to bomb. There's no way to tell the difference between a regular wall or one you can blow up. So if you run out of bombs after coming across a bunch of dud walls, you'll need to grind for more money to go buy more bombs, or grind enemies for bombs, which can take just as long. Using the blue candle doesn't use up any resource of any kind, but that doesn't stop burning every bush you see from being a tedious chore. So without any sort of guide, you'll be burning every bush and blowing up every wall just to find anything. And when you do find something, it can either be a shop with some goodies, a money-making game that could potentially net you a large sum of rupees, a friendly moblin who will give you a certain amount of cash depending on the location, or a dickhead that'll take your money to pay for his door repairs. Well, how about you put a sign outside next time, jerk off? With all that said, I cannot recommend playing this game without a guide, or at the very least a map that tells you the locations of shops, both out in the open and hidden. But trust me, don't bother using the in-game maps unless you're inside a dungeon, because this giant gray blob right here doesn't tell you diddly dick. You were meant to get hints from the manual and use those to discover secrets and make progress, and the game itself even tells you to do so. And while this was revolutionary and fun for kids in the late 80s and early 90s, it's become extremely aged by today's standards. If it was more obvious about where some of the secrets were hidden, then I think it would have aged a bit more gracefully. But even if the game had that going for it, I still don't think it would have aged all that well, and that's mainly due to your control. Link moves like a tank. He can only move in 4 directions. This leads to Link feeling very stiff in his movements, and in combination with the short range of his sword jabs, it feels really awkward to attack enemies in this game. It's not an issue for some of the slower and weaker enemies in early dungeons, but you'll really begin to feel your limitations once enemies start getting faster and more unpredictable. If you're at full health, you'll shoot a sword beam across the whole distance of the screen, which is pretty useful in certain spots in dungeons, but it's such a nipple twister when you lose it after getting hit. You'll start with 3 hearts at the beginning of your quest, but you can locate heart containers in the overworld or by beating dungeon bosses to increase your health by another heart. Getting more hearts will allow you to grab a few sword upgrades, with the white sword requiring 5 hearts and the magical sword requiring 13. The hints that these old men give for this is also pretty cryptic. Master it and you can have it? How can I master something you won't give me, asshole? Most of the hints the old men give you aren't as ambiguous, but some of these needed a second pass. A few of them will give you hints on where some items are or what items certain bosses are weak to, and then there's this one where the old man pretty much tells you to drown yourself. That's the last time I take advice from a stranger in a death trap-filled dungeon. So no matter whether or not you use a guide, dungeons are going to be your points of interest to make any sort of progress, as not only do they hold a piece of the Triforce of Wisdom, but they also contain some useful items for your journey. Do yourself a favor and grab as many items as you can before entering Dungeon 1. If you go into the first dungeon with just that pitiful wooden sword and nothing else, you are going to become Octorok food. The early game is rough. With the lack of maneuverability and any sort of good offense, it feels like enemies just dogpile you every chance they can get. So getting extra heart containers, the white sword, and the blue ring before the first dungeon will help out exponentially. Dungeons have a pretty primitive form in comparison to the ones from A Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time. There isn't really a lot of puzzle solving aside from push a block here or use an item here. There's this one room in Dungeon 7 that has this Goria that just says grumble grumble. Is he disgruntled? Hungry?
Alright, time to execute my trick.
Most of the time you're thrown into gauntlet rooms where you need to defeat all the enemies to make progress. At first it's not too bad. You got these Stalfos that move pretty slow and aren't that much of a threat, these Hershey Kisses that hop everywhere, maybe a Moldorm every once in a while, and these mouse-looking pose voice things. But then you get to Dungeon 3 where you're introduced to the Dark Nuts. They may move slowly, but they can only be attacked from the back or the side. They're invincible from the front. And they can turn on a dime in some instances, which can lead to you taking a few pot shots. The red variants aren't too bad, but then Dungeon 5 throws the blue ones at you, and they move faster and hit like semi-trucks. Most of the time, enemy challenge comes from your lack of good control. Sometimes you'll get locked in a room until all the enemies are defeated, and if you're in a room with enemies you can't stand, you'll be begging for a deal with Ganon himself to get out.
Help! Open the door! Help! I'm locked in with a killer! Ah!
Losing all your health obviously results in a game over, but dying in a dungeon will just put you back at the start, so unless you die in the overworld, you never have to journey back to a dungeon after death. If you take too much damage, you can ingest a red or blue potion to recover all your health, which is a godsend in later dungeons. And plenty of shops around the kingdom have red potions at a cheap price, so don't be afraid to use them when you need to, especially once you start encountering whiz robes. My god, the whiz robes! Their Link to the Past counterparts can be kind of annoying, but these incarnations are the bane of my fucking existence. Got their fucking teleporting right onto me and their beam shooting and the fact that a lot of rooms in the last few dungeons are just Wizrub gangbangs. Getting through the dungeons honestly just comes down to whether you can get through the enemy hordes, which, yeah, some of these rooms can be bitches, but I'd say the dungeons don't offer much challenge outside of that, especially because the bosses are absolute cakewalks. Aquamentus goes down like a bitch. The Dongos aren't too mobile, so they're easy to take care of. Manhandla can be taken out quickly with a few bombs, or one if you're lucky. And Digdogger and Goma become easy prey with their item of weakness. The only bosses to give me any sort of challenge was my man motherfucking Gleeok, baby! That was mainly because the latter two encounters had more heads, which means more projectiles, and Ganon himself, who's only hard because you never know where he teleports to, and you kinda have to swing wildly in order to do any damage to him since he's invisible. But before you can fight him, you need to make your way through Ganon's dungeon in Spectacle Rock on Death Mountain. This place is huge, and it can be so easy to get lost if you don't have the Master Key that can unlock every door in the game. And don't rely on the in-game map. Use a legitimate one online, because you will get lost. I personally had to do this dungeon 4 times. One time that led to my death, another time because of an accidental game reset, another time because I ran out of bombs, and another time because I forgot the silver arrows. And I know that's technically not the game's fault, but I'm gonna bitch! There are so many fucking dead ends in this place with a horde of Wizrobes waiting to drink your bodily fluids. You also run into Patras, these bug things that surround themselves with smaller bugs, and they can be a bitch to take out. Ganon awaits somewhere inside, but before you even think about fighting Ganon, get the 2 dungeon items, the red ring and the silver arrows. The red ring is the last defense upgrade, which will help you with your final stretch. And I do think Link legitimately looks good in red. Then there's the silver arrows. This is the only item that can deal the final blow to Ganon, which the only hint you have about that is from this old guy in Dungeon 5. I'd be throwing more of a fit if I didn't have any sort of guide to use, and I'll state that again, if there's any chance of you having fun in this game, it's with a guide. Once Ganon drops, he'll explode into a blood pile with the Triforce of Wisdom available to grab. By heading into the next room, Link is able to find Zelda, and Link's quest is finally over. Holy shit, that was a mess. While I am happy that I was finally able to go back and play this game, I don't know if I can ever bring myself to do it again for any sort of enjoyment. The Legend of Zelda is truly a product of its time, and while the ideas and mechanics it brings forth were truly a marvel in its heyday, it has become rather antiquated by the standards of games in 2025. Is there any merit in playing it now? Honestly, I'd still say yes. While it's true that this game is severely outdated and old-fashioned, I do think you owe it to yourself to at least play this game once to experience the beginnings of one of gaming's biggest giants. I think going through this game has made me appreciate the way that games like Link to the Past, Ocarina of Time, and Breath of the Wild were structured. But should you bother with a second playthrough? Unless you seriously find any enjoyment, no. There is a second quest that you can do after beating the game that changes item locations and dungeon layouts, but I think I've had my fill from the original NES title. Although I would be willing to deal with the Wizrobes again if that means I get to experience capital punishment.
All in all, I'd say my experience with the first game was frustrating, but it's not the hardest game I've ever played before. I mean, if I can compare it to something, I'd honestly say it's easier to play than the Lost Levels. However, that was mainly because I was using a guide, and I hope for the next title I don't have to rely on it as much. We're closing out our Zelda revisit next time with Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link. I don't know why it's just Zelda 2. Why is it not The Legend of Zelda 2? I'm going to rip into that next time. So, with all that being said, thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you all then.
Many years ago, Prince Darkness Ganon stole one of the I fucking can't do that. Okay.